Hello again, everyone. Welcome to Dinner and a Movie. I'm James Hoadley. I am the Associate Director of the Center for International Business Education Research at Georgia Tech, and I'm also the co-chair of the Programs Committee for the Japan-American Society of Georgia. Thank you for joining us for our Dinner and a Movie. We're talking this time about Shoplifters, and I've entitled this presentation, this is the presentation that you would listen to before you watch the film so that you understand what's going on. I've tried really hard to keep it spoiler free, so you can feel free to watch without worrying that you find out something about the film that you didn't want to know, that you wanted it to be revealed as you were watching. And I've entitled this presentation Shoplifters in Japan's Hidden Poverty because I think that's an issue that is talked about. It's a very significant theme of the film. So, let's get started. So the plot summary, and you can see this is not a still from the film. This is a neighborhood in Tokyo. It's actually unchanged from the Showa era, which was the era that basically started in the 1920s and lasted until the 1980s, but really kind of this is how much of Tokyo looked in the post-war period, say the 1950s or so, and is relatively unchanged. In fact, this photograph, which I found online, it's not my own photograph, is so stereotypically maybe 1940s, 1950s Showa period. It might actually not be it might be a movie set rather than an actual neighborhood. So the plot summary, in a shitamachi, Tokyo, of course, is divided into the high city and low city, to use the words of the late great Japanologist Edward Seidensticker. He had a book called High City, Low City. Shitamachi literally means low village or low town. And shitamachis still exist in Tokyo today. They are lower class neighborhoods in the greater Tokyo area. There are shitamachis other places as well, although they might be referred to. Shitamachi might be more commonly used as a reference in Tokyo than it is in other cities, say Osaka or Nagoya, for example. Anyway, in the shitamachi, there is a group of people who live together as a family, although the ties between them are very non-conventional. Told you it was no spoilers. I'm not going to tell you how they are connected to each other. You will find that out through the process of the film. They are poor, and they supplement their meager income by shoplifting and petty theft. Everyone has a unique story for how they wound up here. The addition of a new family member, a young girl, under very interesting circumstances, changes the dynamics of the group. The story has many significant twists as everyone's secrets are revealed. So the film grossed $76 million worldwide, mostly in Japan and China. $76 million, of course, does not seem like a whole lot for a Western blockbuster film when we have, although this year they'd be very happy, most of them would be very happy to be earning $76 million. But in a normal non-COVID year when theaters are open, things like Disney's Avengers series or other films of that, the tentpole films, hundreds of millions of dollars or even $1 billion is not unheard of. But for a film of this type, a small film with a not internationally known cast, unfortunately, $76 million is pretty good. And the fact that it made a lot of it in Japan, because there have been a number of great Japanese films that have not made a whole lot of money in Japan. For example, one of my other favorite Japanese films, which was the first film in the Dinner and a Movie series, Departures, made the majority of its money overseas and not in Japan. But this film, Shoplifters, did earn the largest portion of its gross in Japan. It's got a 99% certified fresh on Rotten Tomatoes of the professional film critics. Hard to do much better than that. And I know that sometimes there are films that the critics enjoy, but the audience does not. This one has a 91% audience score. So it's a film that a lot of people like very much, um, myself included. It's a very interesting story. It's not the easiest movie to watch, but definitely a worthwhile film that will leave you feeling very satisfied by the end, but also it will evoke strong emotional reactions. No spoilers there. It won the Palme d'Or, the Golden Palm at Cannes, the first Japanese film since 1997's The Eel to win. And it was nominated for the Academy Award for Best Foreign Language Film. It did not win, uh, but it was selected as a finalist basically for that, so it was well recognized for that as well. So we're going to talk about the themes of the film, and to keep myself in on a time schedule, I'm going to use slides and a written script uh, rather than just go ahead and freeform me like I have been up until now. And so the four things I'm going to cover will be divided up into Rich Japan, Poor Japanese, Crime and Punishment in Japan, Lonely Death, and Family by Blood versus Family by Choice. I think these are the unique elements of the film that you will better understand with some prepping ahead of time. So let's move right ahead. Let's talk about Rich Japan, Poor Japanese. The period from the bursting of the bubble economy around 1990 and for 2 or 3 decades after is referred to as the Lost Generation. So under Rich Japan, Poor Japanese, we've got Lost Generation. We are going to be talking about freeters, and we're going to be talking about the cyber homeless. Okay. So the 1990s, the Lost Generation. The 1990s saw the slow death of lifetime employment. Lifetime employment only applied to people who worked for large multinational firms or government ministries. This was only about 1/5 to 1/4 of the total working population. Everyone else has always had to deal with the specter of lost jobs or had to rely on government provided health care and pensions. However, the generation that came of age in the mid 90s, graduating from high school and college during that period of time, after the asset price bubble burst, have had to contend with no steady jobs for a large number of them. The rise of so called freeters, or freelance employees, very similar to the American gig economy, began to appear in the 1990s as large multinationals embraced temporary employees for all but the most critical jobs, as well as foreign contract employees. While foreign employees often left Japan when the job visas expired, eliminating responsibility for them, but the remaining Japanese citizens have never held a steady job, have never had the opportunity to accumulate wealth for retirement, and hence will be dependent upon the national pension plan. Given that Japan's national debt is more than 2.5 times GDP, a level which hasn't been seen since the last days of World War II, the future does not look very bright. The Bank of Japan is the largest single holder of Japanese government debt, which means that the government owes money to itself. But at least it's not like the United States, where the Social Security Administration is the largest holder of U.S. public debt. It is not the Chinese, it is the Social Security Administration. Go ahead and look it up. The Lost Generation's freeter workers have never had the opportunity to accumulate any personal savings or assets. Japan has a significant homeless problem, but a lot of it is invisible. Of course, there are homeless men living in parks and other public spaces in large cities in Japan who are predominantly middle-aged and older males who have lost their jobs, often in manufacturing or construction, and are either shunned by their families or are ashamed by no longer being able to fulfill the role of breadwinner. Alcoholism and untreated mental illness contribute to this significant problem. But until COVID, there was a large contingent of invisible homeless as well. Those people took refuge at night in net cafes and other 24-hour establishments as the only place where they could afford to sleep. Net cafes were cheaper on an hourly basis than capsule hotels, and often offered more room than a capsule hotel. COVID-19 has closed practically all net cafes, meaning the so-called cyber homeless are being pushed into the ranks of other homeless. Japan, unlike most other OECD countries, that's the richest countries in the world, does not have an official poverty level. The United States sets an official poverty level. Many other countries have an official level below which people are classified as living in poverty. Japan does not have an officially defined level of poverty, which makes defining and tracking poverty that much more difficult. Crime and punishment in Japan. Okay, we're going to talk about Japan's Code of Criminal Procedure. We're going to talk about the high confession rate, and we're going to talk about low youth recidivism. A lot of this has been expanded because of the prosecution of Carlos Ghosn and his then fleeing the country. So in Japan, Japanese police can hold a suspect for 48 hours before the suspect must be transferred to the public prosecutor. The prosecutor then has 24 hours to either charge the suspect or apply for a 10-day extension. A second 10-day extension can be requested and granted, meaning a suspect can be held for 23 days without charge. Additionally, before the 23 days are up, the prosecutor can direct the police to re-arrest the subject, thus restarting the 23-day clock. Meaning, as long as they can keep coming up with new charges to arrest you on, then they can keep resetting the clock indefinitely. This can go on for quite a while. Carlos Ghosn, at the time of his escape, had gone through this cycle of arrest and detention without criminal charge 4 times when he fled the country. Other than dismissal of charges, there is no way to avoid trial in Japan. In other words, plea bargaining is not really a thing. As a result, in 70% of cases that go to trial, the trial begins with a reading of the charges and a complete acceptance, admission to all charges by the defense attorney, including a submission of a sworn confession by the accused. In the remaining 30% of cases, the defense attorney concedes that a crime has been committed, but that the charges are excessive. So this is basically their way of trying to plea bargain, but it has to be done in the situation of a criminal trial. A statement of innocence is exceedingly rare, like about 1% of cases. Japanese courts are primarily a place to plead for clemency and to express remorse, not to challenge the facts of the case. Japanese prosecutors almost unerringly don't bring charges in cases where a guilty verdict is in question, choosing to dismiss the charges or to require payment of a fine and writing of the all-important apology letter in cases where they are pretty sure they wouldn't be able to get a rock-solid conviction. Initial youth crime, in other words, youth are going out in Japan and committing crimes at essentially or pretty close to the same rate as other countries for the first crime. But recidivism is remarkably low. Parole officers are almost all unpaid volunteers in Japan, and communities tend to work to prevent recidivism. The notable exception, of course, are the Yakuza, who recruit from the most incorrigible for their highly structured criminal enterprises. In the year 2000, a man was discovered in a apartment complex who had passed away alone in his apartment 3 years prior. He went undiscovered for 3 years. His rent and utilities were automatically deducted from his savings account. It took 3 years to use up all of his savings, eventually resulting in a welfare check that revealed his skeletal remains, the flesh having been removed by scavenging insects over the 3 years. The media seized on this story and publicized the statistic that approximately 4,000 so-called lonely deaths, where people die alone, occurred nationwide every day. In the past, Japanese families were large and multi-generational, but the rise of the nuclear family in the post-war era, as well as the low reproductive rate, have meant that there are many elderly Japanese who have few or even no family members to take care of them or notice when they die. Additionally, Japanese people who are experiencing economic difficulties often keep those difficulties to themselves. Now, this is not unique to Japan. It certainly occurs for all throughout the world. People feel um, shame at the fact that they are not able to economically take care of themselves. But it seems in Japan that the mean distribution, the average person who is elderly and suffering from economic problems, is less likely to ask for help than anybody else anywhere in the world. And this contributes to the so-called lonely deaths. Family by blood versus family by choice. So we're going to talk about the rise of domestic violence during the Heisei era, the end of the nuclear family, and the acceptance of divorce. So under current Japanese law, domestic violence is not adjudicated by the criminal justice system, but by the civil court system. That was the best citation that I was able to find on the web. According to statistics, 80% of domestic violence victims are women, but between 2014 and 2018, male victims of domestic violence tripled to 15,964. 2019 saw a record number of reported cases of child abuse, which was totaled 160,000 reported cases of child abuse, which was an increase of 43%. The largest referred cases of child abuse were instances of psychological abuse. This marks a significant turnaround. Only a decade ago, psychological abuse was the second lowest category by number of referred cases. Now it is the highest and is twice the rate of physical abuse. But abuse of spouse, abuse of children, these are all still significant problems in Japan. There's been some movement in a good direction. The statistics report a rise in domestic abuse during the Heisei era. The Heisei era, of course, extends during the reign of Emperor Heisei, the emperor who just retired, which was from 1989 until basically last year. So during that period, there was a rise in the number of reported cases. Now, whether that was a case that there were more reports, actually, the statistic about psychological abuse seems to indicate that people have begun to accept that psychological abuse is a thing and it is something that requires intervention by potentially government authorities, and not just something that should have a blind eye turned towards it. But there certainly has been, I am not qualified to say, because I have only lived in Japan during the Heisei era. So I am not qualified to say whether the amount of abuse and I don't know that anyone is qualified to say whether the amount of domestic abuse has gone up, gone down, or is simply being addressed, whereas it wasn't previously. There's now a term in Japanese to refer to domestic violence. They call it DV, which is literally the Japanese pronunciation of the letters DV for domestic violence. That is a term, when I moved to Japan in the mid-1990s, that I don't think anyone was even aware of. And today, everyone that you would grab off the street, if you ask them, what is DV, if you say it right, they'll know. They'll know and they will recognize it. It's a very commonly understood term. So there's certainly a great deal more recognition. Also, as mentioned before, the multi-generational family, which is exemplified by the best example I can think of a multi-generational family that everybody knows, is the long-running, very family-friendly anime Sazae-san. So Sazae-san was based on a manga that started in 1946. And in 1946, the family of three generations all living in the same house was quite common. And when you look at the anime that is based off of the manga, now the anime started in 1969 and is still going today, you still have a three-generation household living in the same house. Today, multi-generational families are very rare, quite uncommon. You might have, particularly in rural areas, you might have families living close to each other, but at most you'll have two generations living, parents and children living in a house, not grandparents and like maybe aunts and uncles or cousins or that sort of thing, all living under the same roof. This is partially the result of the fiscal wealth that has developed in Japan, but it's also partially a result of changing lifestyles. So 1946, which is still a living memory, very common. 1969, less common, but still common enough. And now, very unusual to find multiple generations living in the same house. Divorce. Japan's divorce rate peaked at about 2002. We kind of talked about this a bit in the last movie because it's centered around divorce, but in case you didn't join us for that one, or if, just to keep us up to speed, Japan's divorce rate peaked at about 2002 before declining slightly and plateauing. So one factor that is believed to keep the divorce rate from rising higher is that the marriage rate has declined since 2002. You can't get divorced if you didn't get married in the first place. Japanese are getting married at older and older ages. In the 25 years from 1995 to 2020, the average age for men and women increased by 3 years, so that now the average Japanese is 30 before they get married. Another trend which may be causing that may be rising, a trend that may be rising, is, although I don't know if it's catching on or if it's just because it's got a term and it's kind of different, it's appearing a lot in media, but how many people are actually doing it, who knows. So another trend that may be rising is the idea of sotsukon, which is graduating from marriage, sotsu like sotsugyo, to graduate, and kon like konnyaku, to be engaged, or kekkon, to be married. Sotsukon means to graduate from marriage. So couples who sotsukon remain legally married but live separate lives with separate domiciles and pursuits. There was a comedian who wrote a book, I think in 2008, about sotsukon, which also brought some attention to the issue. Who was a celebrity writing about it. Sotsukon, I think, is an ideal, but it might be hard to execute in practice because it requires a level of mutual cooperation between the husband and wife. And if the husband and wife hate each other, they can't collaborate to create this sotsukon environment. So there's actually, and if the couples are getting along, then why do they need to sotsukon? I don't know. It's certainly something that is talked about a lot, but I don't know how popular it really is. And of course, statistics on it are sparse. And finally, adoption. Adoption is very different in Japan. In America and most Western cultures, adoption is something that is done with young children who do not have parents, and they are typically adopted by families who either don't have children or who want more children, and the children are brought in and raised as members of the family, and there are lots of different ways of approaching it. Sometimes the children are not told. Many times the children are told that they are adopted. Um, that type of adoption, very much a wonderful thing. Very happy when that happens and works out very well. It's a great thing. It's not terribly common for that to occur in Japan, for parents to adopt a child. Even today, the majority of adoptions in Japan occur in family. They occur that a family adopts an adult male. In a family that has no male heirs, particularly if that family has some kind of asset in the family that needs to be passed down. Many times it's a family business. Sometimes it is that the family is composed of highly skilled artisans, for example, kabuki performers or sword makers. If they only have daughters, then they can't pass, well, that's changing as well, but traditionally they could not pass down their craft or their business to their daughter. But what they would do is for the eldest daughter, the man who married the eldest daughter would be adopted into the household as a son and would be treated exactly as a son. That's, that's fine. That's great if it works out for people, but it doesn't address the problem of children who don't have parents or children who are unwanted. Um, there is a general cultural aversion to bringing other people's children into your home and raising them as your own. And the result of that, although certainly there are people who are taking actions to try and correct that problem, such as the some of them are very, very simple, but in Japan there have been a number of charitable organizations that have implemented the so-called baby hatch, which for for women who have a child that they do not want, the baby hatch basically works that there is a door and the child is placed in there, and once the child is placed in the baby hatch, there is immediately an alert that goes to someone who works inside that building so that they know that there is a child, and they will come down and the child will be taken care of. That's still pretty new. It's new enough that it gets covered on the Japanese news when they establish a baby hatch, so that people talk about it because they're aware of it, but it's not very common. Orphanages, I've been to an orphanage in Japan, and I'm not, it's the people who are there work very hard and they're very dedicated about what they do, and it's certainly not Oliver Twist or anything like that. But the children grow up without really a sense of family, and it's really heartbreaking to see these kids, because when you go and visit them, they are super happy to see you because they have been deprived of family contact. And this, well, I won't tell you how it's relevant to the film because remember, no spoilers. But yeah, so it's not simply a case where if you have a child that you can't raise, that you can place that child in adoption, and that's not really as much of it's certainly not an easy option in America, but it's a much more viable option in America than it is in Japan. Okay. So, advice for watching the film. As the father of a 9-year-old, I don't feel comfortable with my 9-year-old watching this film. It's up to yourself to decide. There's nudity, there's sexual content, and those are, of course, very uncomfortable. But equal to those, at least equal to those, and perhaps even more so, is some of the dark overall themes of it's well done, but it's not a cheerful film. There's a lot of bad things that happen. So I don't feel that it is suitable for children below a certain age where they're able to accept that. And if you are a parent, you are the person who is in the best position to decide whether your child is ready to accept that or not. So I'm just letting you know I'm not showing it to my 9-year-old because I think it would freak her out. But you, as a parent, they're your children. You make the decision as to what's best. Maybe if you're thinking about showing it to younger kids, you should watch it first, and then make up your mind whether you think that they'll be okay with it or not. It certainly will evoke strong emotions and maybe some questions, and it's up to you whether you want to have those conversations or not. Also, my advice, another piece of advice for watching is there's a lot of things that happen in the film. Trying to explain it in a way that doesn't spoil things. People's connections to each other and how they kind of wound up in this situation gets kind of confusing because it's thrown at you pretty fast, and people, they are fulfilling roles, but these are not roles that they have come into in what we would consider to be a standard way. They've come into it through a rather unusual way, all of them. And so the story can be confusing, so it might be helpful if you're going to get confused, because I've had to watch it a couple of times to make sure that I understood everything that was going on. To when you're watching it the first time, if it's not too much, if it doesn't take you out, it's again, it's your choice. If it doesn't take you out of the experience of the film, you might want to have just like a little notepad or some sticky notes or something like that, and keep track of who is who and how they wound up there. So you might want to just keep some notes if that helps. Or maybe you just want to watch it once through and then watch it again and take notes or something like that to try and figure out, because there's a lot of detail and a lot of interesting stories. Okay, because this is Dinner and a Movie, I don't think this is the kind of movie that makes for good watching while you're eating. You need to focus on it for one thing, and the other thing is that some of it is kind of harsh. So I would eat before I watch it, but things that would go with it thematically, ramen, particularly instant ramen, might be a good one on this one. If you can find it, dishes containing fu, which is hard to find because in Japan, and of course in America, many of us are avoiding wheat gluten, whereas in Japan, fu is wheat gluten made into, I say cake, it's made into something that sort of looks like a crouton, but it's not a crouton. I remember the first time when I had moved, shortly after I had moved to Japan, and I encountered fu, and I thought they were croutons, and I was wrong. They don't work very well as croutons. In their proper situation, they are delicious, but they're not a substitute for croutons. Or croquettes. Croquettes are also something that you will feel a connection to the film. So that said, I think I've covered everything, and I wanted to try and keep it short. So here you go. I hope you enjoy the film, and we'll be coming back to you on a time that we have almost set, but we haven't 100% set. So I will leave it to the announcement on this to declare exactly what day we're going to get together and talk about the film, because this is a film you're going to have a lot that you're going to want to talk about. I think it's a very well-made film. I think that it's a very engrossing film. It's a very moving film, and I hope that you will enjoy it as I have, and feel that you are enriched by having watched it. So thank you, and hopefully I'll see you on the other side.